So, on the topic of ribit, this is really interesting. There aren't that many mitzvot in the Torah that, let's say, apply exclusively to Jews. What I mean is that, sure, we have an obligation to eat kosher meat. Kosher meat is meat that was slaughtered by a Jew who knows how to perform kosher shechita. You have an obligation to put up the mezuzot and wear tefillin, and it'd have to be written by, a Jew who knows the halachot that pertain to it. There happen to be a number of areas in which halacha, at least theoretically, or maybe at least biblically, applies a little bit differently to Jews and to non-Jews. And I will predicate this on the understanding that today, little, if any of this, is actually still the case. The reason I bring it up is because, under certain circumstances, certain cases, it might come out. People have wrong understandings of it. You read a pasuk in the Torah and you say, "Oh, that must be halacha. That's how we do it." Not necessarily the case. So, we're told when it comes to ribit and neshech that we have an obligation not to exact these kinds of profits or benefits from a fellow Jew. Why? Because it's said in the context that you're to refrain from these behaviors because your job is to make sure that your brother, your peer, your fellow Jew, colleague, co-religionist should be able to live with you or like you. So we actually have an explicit pasuk, and this is one of the very few examples of this in the Torah. We have, for example, by the Shemitah, that whatever loans you have out to non-Jews, you can collect on. You can even take ribit. What you have by your brother, loans that you have from your brother, you should let go of, at the end of the Shemitah. Mida oraita, this concept of taking a ribit, of charging interest, doesn't apply to goyim. You're not obligated to facilitate their ability to live with you or their ability to live like you. In other words, the Torah doesn't make guarantees like this. But it's funny because it came up recently in a political discussion. People are talking about the constitutional right that immigrants have to come to the United States of America. The United States Constitution does not guarantee any constitutional rights to anybody but the citizens of the United States of America. No one in Mexico can say, but the U.S. Constitution promises me that I can come to America and I can live there. Well, we have immigration rules. You can come, you cannot. You're supposed to be checked or vetted, like the San Bernardino killers. The fact that the law, addresses only the citizens of the country in which the law applies is presumed to be a pretty universal concept in jurisprudence. Today, there's a lot of activists who say, no, obviously there are, civil rights and Bill of Rights that apply to people who aren't even citizens of America. So if somebody came here and stole something, sure, habeas corpus, you have to have a protocol and process for how you deal with criminals, and to do it justly. But to say that the law was written for people who aren't even citizens of the country, have no loyalty to it, and no desire or obligation to defend it, is something else. It's not that the Torah wants all the goyim dead. We have to be very clear about this. There's no reason the Torah would want such a thing, never in a million years. We aren't big fans of idolatry, but at the same time we don't have any mitzvah to get rid of it outside of the land of Israel. When the land of Israel is populated by mostly Jews, maybe this applies more midoraita than now, but obviously we're not commended to go invade foreign countries to get rid of their avodah zarah. We're not the world's spiritual policemen that way. It's not necessarily a surprise to us that the Torah commands us to do or not to do certain things, just that some of those behaviors that seem categorized as negative within the nation, aren't necessarily forbidden outside of it. A few other examples of this. Hashevat Aveda. Hashevat Aveda is basically returning a stolen, or potentially lost or a stolen article. And here we're told that avidat achicha. If you find one of your brother's objects, lost or missing, then you should return it to him. Very often when the Torah tells you your brother, it comes to exclude a number of people. Number one, it comes to exclude someone who is not necessarily Jewish, because this is not your brother per se. Doesn't mean it's a bad or evil thing to return a stolen object or lost object to a non-Jew, but the Torah didn't necessarily accord this responsibility to every Jew to find lost and stolen articles of non-Jews. It may also exclude, and in many cases it does, what the Torah calls achicha sheba mitzvot, or sheba mitzvot, meaning your brother in mitzvot. And this might even exclude a non-observant Jew. We spoke about the Reform before. This is the perfect segue. So there are plenty of mitzvot that don't apply to someone who's not religious. A classic example of this would be lo tarech rachil be'amecha. You shouldn't go around spreading rumors or telling tales about people in your nation. And here Chazal said, be'amecha be'oseh ma'aseh amecha. That's only to include those people who behave as though they're part of your nation, i.e. those who do the things that your nation does, which is observe the Torah and mitzvot.
Yeah, but the majority of our nation doesn't necessarily...
Well, this becomes a very tricky question. Someone becomes a Rasha and becomes divisive or derides the Torah and the mitzvot, the obligation not to speak negatively about him no longer applies. That's just the way it is. Now, who falls into this category, under what terms, etc., so we can talk. But that's the long and short of it.
So we still don't have a mitzvah to say Lashon Hara about him.
Whether or not there's a mitzvah specifically to say Lashon Hara about him is right. Maybe to a certain degree debatable. The Gemara says Masechet Yoma that on Yom Kippur, because that was the only day everybody came to the Beit Knesset, almost everybody, they used to run off a list of people who were known criminals and corrupt, and God forbid if there was a child molester or someone doing something crazy. That'd be the time there was the public service announcements. What else could they make them? You wanted the entire community to know about something. They didn't have pamphlets. They didn't have the internet, text messages, WhatsApp. So they announced it in the Beit Knesset. You would say Yom Kippur, everybody should be so concerned and so afraid. Yeah, except if you're talking about an absolute jerk who's dangerous and who's robbed people, someone who's cheated in contracts and business.
Who's refusing get or stuff like that.
Someone who's refusing a get, absolutely. These are the types of people who destroy society. So there's no chassidut in avoiding them as a topic of discussion. Maybe we would have less crime if people were more aware of these people and what they were doing. So, technically, the Torah doesn't forbid you from taking interest in a transaction that involves a non-Jew. Sorry, what that could potentially translate into is an all-out war on Torah and Jews and Judaism, because the Torah doesn't guarantee the same rights or protections to the non-Jews as it does to the Jews. At the end of the day, what's written is written. What we practice is not necessarily identical. So Chazal, a priori, in theory anyway, in principle, forbade the practice of taking interest from Goyim. Why? Believe it or not. So you shouldn't come to learn from their ways and conduct yourself like this with everyone else. Meaning, if you get in the habit of taking interest from Goyim in your interactions with them, eventually you're going to establish business practices, or you're going to develop habits that incorporate this into your daily lifestyle. And you'll do it even when it comes to Jews. So imagine that. It's not that we're commanded to take advantage of the non-Jews, it's that, chas v'shalom, because the non-Jews, at the time anyway, or those that are referred to by the Torah, took advantage of other people, we need to learn how not to behave like this. At least with other Jews, we should be, the business of protecting ourselves and each other. So, be careful not to behave this way when it comes to other people. There is, and I mentioned this in all seriousness, the Torah commands, it prescribes capital punishment for murder. And we define that somewhat narrowly as a Jew killing another Jew. They're both subject to these laws, and we can execute, it's a capital crime, we can execute a Jew for killing another Jew. What happens if a Jew killed a non-Jew? Someone who's non-Jews typically aren't represented, let's say, in the biblical commandments the way they appear. So it's a surah for many reasons. Some of the Mefarshim point out that if nothing else, the surah is a tremendous chilul Hashem. How could a nation that claims to be righteous, that claims to be spiritual, that claims to lead the world in monotheism, condone the killing of anybody? A criminal, yes. In a time of war, okay, it happens. But to condone the killing of anyone is such an outrage. It's so antithetical to what it is that we stand for. Maybe it falls under the category of chilul Hashem, and therefore, just like a chilul Hashem is never punishable in a human court, so too it's not a prosecutable crime. Others will tell you it actually is a prosecutable crime. The Beit Din can punish you. In fact, they can even kill you extrajudiciously. They can decide as a Beit Din, this is how we're going to kill you, but they couldn't prescribe one of the 4 capital punishments for it. There's other ways to kill people, and maybe they can do something like that. Or they could, incarcerate you, they can beat you up. Sure, all this and then some. Not to say, God forbid, that we're in favor of people being killed or people being taken advantage of. The understanding of Chazal was that this is a practice that the non-Jews around us engaged in. We have to be careful about it, not to mimic their behaviors and basically do this to take advantage of each other, when the reality is that we're commanded to be extra careful about helping our brothers and sisters and not copying such behaviors. That having been said, and it's funny that it comes up tonight because I didn't really mean to focus on this particularly, the Gemara does leave room for someone to say tzurva mirabanan. This is a very common expression in Aramaic. Tzurva mirabanan is a tzurva dirabanan is a Rashi defines as a young Talmid Chacham. And he finds someone who's a young Talmid Chacham, who's sharp, who's with it, who has halacha at his fingertips. We don't have this suspicion that he's going to learn from these ways and conduct himself this way with everybody else. So technically, he reverts back to the original biblical status of it, which is that it's somehow permissible. So, a word of musar is in order. Obviously, we're constantly being scrutinized and surveyed, and people take very seriously all sorts of allegations of impropriety, and any behavior they perceive as corrupt, they're going to blow up and spread. We have an obligation to be as straight as possible when it comes to our dealings with people, especially in business, and so much the more so in light of the fact that Yimach Shema, many of the anti-Semites do try to point to business practices or to the corrupt business practices of a few people who are known to be Jewish and unfortunately made bad decisions. You'll find a lot of press, a lot of attention paid to things like this. Bernie Madoff is a great example of this. The guy's Rasha on levels that we can't possibly imagine, but the Chilul Hashem that he created and the stereotypes that he effectively justified with his behavior, with his idiotic decision making, is damage done for generations to come. He'll never be able to undo it. So we need to make an effort to really sanctify the Hashem. I'll give you a couple of funny stories about this. One, a story that took place in Brooklyn at the very end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, where Rav Henkin, the famous Rav Henkin, who was had a tremendous respect for Rav Moshe Feinstein, a little bit more strict as a posek. There was a guy who came to Rav Henkin in his Beit Knesset, and he told him that there was this guy who owned a non-Jewish guy who owned some kind of a market, a supermarket, something like that, and he wanted to know that if the guy gave you too much change, are you allowed to keep it? Rav Henkin told him, listen, technically someone gives too much change, it's a mistake, or it's as if something he forgot, has the same status as a lost object. Technically, you may not necessarily be required to give it back. Not from the dry bones of the halacha per se. And he said, should you do it? Absolutely. And if not, so as to avoid Chilul Hashem, you should do it in order to create a Kiddush Hashem. And you can say, look, he's a Jewish guy who is straight, who is honest, and who lives according to this credo, that we should be extra careful about, money and other people's belongings and property. We should respect it. We should pay back. If you took something by accident, you got too much, more than you deserve, you give it back. So he told this guy, you do a Kiddush Hashem. If the guy gives you too much change, be careful that every single penny he gave you, he gets back. The guy went there a few times, and it turned out that every time he went there, the owner of the store gave him extra change. It happened once, it was an accident. It happened twice, it was an oversight. It happened 3 times. And he was a little bit curious about this. Usually people don't throw away money like that for nothing. It turns out that this shopkeeper was a tremendous anti-Semite, and that he used to make a case every time someone was in a supermarket. He would say something like, here, watch this guy. I'm going to give him too much change, he's never going to give it back. When it comes to Jews and the money, forget about it. Good luck getting a penny out of him. So Rav Henkin would consistently give the advice that you create a Kiddush Hashem by conducting yourself this way. Whether or not it's a mutar or asur midoraita is one thing. The bigger picture is your job in Olam Hazeh is to be a Kiddush Hashem, is to inspire people and motivate people to be just like you and to do just like you. Speaking of conversion, how does it cross somebody's mind to convert to Judaism? Normally because they met somebody they were impressed with. So it turns out that this guy was an anti-Semite, and on many occasions he tried to pull something like this off. At least enough people had spoken to Rav Henkin that they knew to give the money back and to be very careful about it. And he wasn't doing it to give the Jews free gifts. He was doing it in order to prosecute them. On the contrary, he was doing it to show people what he believes is true, and to make a case of it. So that's the big picture. There's a really interesting discussion as to what's the status of money that you lend to a non-Jew who then lends to you. Right? Who was it? Abigail was here last week. She was telling us about this, about how she works for a company that effectively services and finances loans. Not that they issue them themselves, but that they broker the loans between the individual or the business and the lending institution, and they purchase the loan from the lending institution and they go ahead and finance it. They make the monthly payment arrangements, etc. So, in theory, if I wanted to circumvent the laws that forbid me from lending money with ribit, with interest, to a Jew, I could lend money to a non-Jew, who can then do whatever he wants with it, and who chooses to lend the money to the Jew with interest.
So you use an intermediate.
Right. I use a middleman. I use a broker, basically. I'm trying to take advantage of the fact that these laws don't apply to him, and I'm using them in order to get interest from somebody I otherwise wouldn't be allowed to take interest from. So it's, interestingly enough, another reason why Chazal were kind of discouraging about this whole concept of, not intentionally charging interest on Jews.
So are we doing that, the intermediate thing, or not so much?
Midoraita, it probably holds water. You probably could get away with such a thing. Because really you're lending the money to the non-Jewish guy. As long as the non-Jewish guy has some kind of a stake or some kind of an interest in it, he's borrowing it for some other purpose, then, sure, it could well be permissible for him to do it. For him to lend the money to a Jew would basically be rendering the mitzvah inapplicable to the particular situation. So, technically mutar, and probably asur midrabanan. It's just another way of charging interest to somebody. Meaning, what you did technically is maybe not a prosecutable crime, but the end result is the same. You're taking advantage of the exemption of the non-Jew in order to do something that you couldn't do directly to a Jew, when in fact you're basically doing the same thing with an added step in the middle. So it's considered cheating, and not something that we condone. But biblically speaking, it might potentially or technically hold water. I'm sorry, we went long today. So, B'ezras Hashem, we'll continue on this next week, and we'll talk about the conservative and reconstructionist movements, the modern state of reform, and active reform in Torah and Judaism.